The first sound was a deep, shuddering thump. Not the kind made by wind shaking the wooden walls of a cabin, nor the restless stirring of a raccoon knocking over a barrel. This was heavier, more final, like something collapsing under its own weight. Farmer Henry's hand froze on the handle of his coffee mug. He had been sitting by the fireplace, savoring the last warmth of his drink, when the noise shattered the stillness of the night. Side the Montana wilderness stretched for miles, dark and unforgiving, the trees swaying under a crisp autumn wind. He wasn't expecting visitors, hadn't for years. His old hunting rifle leaned against the wall, and though he rarely used it, instinct told him to grab it. He moved toward the door, slow and careful. The wooden planks creaked beneath his boots. A lifetime in the wild had taught him that most dangers didn't announce themselves. But this one had. As he reached the door, Henry hesitated. Something about the sound, there was no struggle, no follow-up rustling or movement. Just that one heavy fall. His gut twisted. Taking a steadying breath, he cracked the door open and lifted his lantern. First, he saw nothing but the moonlit snow. Then, just beyond the porch railing, a massive shape lay motionless. A bear. Henry's breath hitched. His grip tightened on the rifle, knuckles white. The animal's enormous body sprawled across the wooden boards, its fur thick but matted, its ribs faintly visible beneath the golden-brown coat. A starving bear. A desperate bear. His first instinct screamed at him to retreat, slam the door, and let nature take its course. A bear this week was unpredictable. Even dying animals could lash out if cornered. But something held him in place. Creature's chest rose and fell, slow and labored. Snout twitched at the air, nostrils flaring, but it made no effort to move. Henry took a step closer, and the lantern's glow revealed its eyes, half open, unfocused. Not the wild, glinting eyes of a predator, but something else. Something he hadn't expected. Exhaustion. The rifle felt heavier in his hands. He could end this now, spare the animal from slow starvation. It wouldn't be the first time he'd put a suffering creature out of its misery. But as he stood there, staring at the beast that had somehow dragged itself onto his porch, he felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. This bear had come here to die. Not to attack. Not to hunt. It had collapsed at his doorstep as if it had nowhere else to go. Henry exhaled through his nose, lowering the rifle. "Damn fool thing," he muttered, shaking his head. He wasn't sure who he was talking to, the bear or himself. Without another thought, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the cabin. A minute later, he returned with a steaming bowl of oatmeal, thick with honey. He set it down carefully on the edge of the porch and stepped back, watching. The bear barely stirred. Then, slowly, with the effort of something that had nearly given up, it lifted its head. Its black nose twitched, catching the scent of the food. A long moment passed. Then another. And then, with a deep, shuddering breath, the bear dragged itself forward and began to eat. Henry watched in silence, the cold wind cutting through his jacket. He knew this was dangerous. Knew he was breaking the unspoken rule of living in the wild. Never feed a bear. But some part of him, deep and buried, told him this wasn't just any bear. And something told him this wasn't the end of their story. Henry barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent his senses into high alert. He had spent decades in these woods and knew better than to let his guard down, especially with a bear lying just beyond his door. As dawn crept over the horizon, he rose from bed, dressed in thick flannel and boots, and reached for his rifle. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the cabin chilled. With cautious steps, he approached the door, cracked it open, and peered outside. The bear was still there. It hadn't moved much, though the empty bowl of oatmeal lay pushed a few inches from where he had placed it. The beast's massive body was curled slightly, breaths coming slow but steady. In the morning light, Henry got a better look at it. Its coat, once thick and proud, was rough and tangled. Deep claw marks ran along its side, wounds partially healed but still raw. This bear had been in a fight. Henry exhaled, rubbing a calloused hand over his chin. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" The bear didn't respond, of course. Something in Henry's gut told him this wasn't just an ordinary case of winter starvation. Something had driven this bear to the brink. It had come to his porch not as a predator, not as a threat, but as something beaten down by nature itself. Common sense screamed at him to let it be. A bear was still a bear. No matter how weak it seemed, it was an apex predator. And yet, he found himself stepping back inside, fixing another batch of oatmeal. This time he made it thicker. More honey. A handful of berries from his dwindling winter supply. If he was going to do this foolish thing, he might as well do it right. When he returned to the porch, the bear stirred, its nose twitching at the scent. Henry set the bowl down carefully, then took a few steps back. The bear lifted its head. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, painfully, the bear dragged itself closer and began to eat. Henry swallowed. He knew the rules of the wild. Feeding a bear could end badly. Could make the creature dependent on him, returning time and time again, expecting handouts. Could make it associate humans with food, one of the fastest ways for a bear to get itself killed. But another part of him, the part that had spent years living in solitude, felt something different. He wasn't saving a bear. He was helping a fellow survivor. ###the town's warning. By the third day, Henry had settled into an odd routine. Each morning, he left a bowl of food on the porch. Each morning, the bear ate. It never came closer than necessary, never made a move toward him. Simply ate, then rested as if gathering its strength. Then, on the fourth day, Henry made the trip into town. Sargus Hollow was small, nothing more than a few supply stores, a diner, and a gas station where old-timers gathered to swap stories. He parked his truck outside the general store, nodding to the locals as he stepped inside. "Morning, Henry," called Greg, the store owner. "Stocking up for the storm?" "Something like that." As he gathered oats, honey, and a fresh bag of coffee, he overheard two men at the counter talking. "Big one came through last week," one of them muttered. "Near Blackridge Pass. Tore up some cattle, left nothing but bones." "Bear?" the other asked. Greg nodded. "Yeah. A bad one. Old Gus saw it. Said it was desperate, probably starving. A bear like that, it's got nothing to lose." Henry's stomach turned. He paid for his supplies and left without another word, his mind racing. The bear on his porch was the same one they were talking about. How long before someone else found it? Before the town saw it as a threat and put it down? He gripped the wheel of his truck, staring down the long road back to his cabin. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe he had just invited danger into his life. But deep down he already knew he couldn't turn back now. Henry woke before sunrise, as he always did, but the air felt different. Cabin was colder than usual, the silence outside heavier. He threw on his coat, grabbed his lantern, and stepped onto the porch. The bear was gone. His eyes swept over the wooden planks where the creature had lain for days. Nothing. No deep paw prints in the frost, no overturned bowl. Just the faint imprint of its massive body pressed into the wood, like a ghost of something that had once been there. Henry frowned, his breath curling in the crisp morning air. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the frozen ground, and scanned the area. The bear had been weak. It shouldn't have gone far. And yet there was no sign of it. No tracks. No broken branches leading into the woods. Just an unsettling emptiness, as if the bear had simply vanished. A strange unease crawled up Henry's spine. Had it wandered off in the night, too weak to survive? Had something else come through and dragged it away? He shook his head. No, he told himself. It left on its own. He should have been relieved. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? He had taken a risk feeding the animal, and now it was gone. He could go back to his normal life, no longer worrying about a bear lingering on his porch. So why did he feel like something was missing? ####, the storm moves in. That afternoon, thick gray clouds rolled in over the valley. Henry didn't need a radio to know a storm was coming. He felt it in his bones. The air grew heavier, the wind sharper. The scent of snow clung to the air. Winter had arrived. He spent the day chopping wood, stacking logs by the door, making sure he had enough to last through the worst of it. By nightfall, the first flakes had begun to fall, spiraling lazily through the trees before vanishing into the earth. Henry stood on the porch, lantern in hand, watching the snow gather on the ground. His eyes flicked toward the tree line. No movement. No sign of the bear. He sighed and turned back inside. By midnight, the storm had turned violent. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the windows, pushing against the walls of the cabin with an angry force. Snow piled high against the door, and the fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. Then, just as Henry was drifting off in his chair, there was a sound. A deep, low thud. His eyes snapped open. For a heartbeat, he thought he had imagined it, just another branch breaking under the weight of the storm. But then it came again. Thud. Not the wind. Not a tree. Something heavy. Something alive. Henry's pulse quickened. He grabbed his lantern, hands steady despite the unease curling in his gut. He stepped to the door, pausing for a moment before pulling it open. Snow rushed in, swirling around his boots, the cold biting at his skin. His lantern's glow barely cut through the storm, but just beyond the reach of its light, a dark shape loomed. Henry's breath caught. It was the bear. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, half hidden in the blizzard, shadows shifted, massive figures moving as one. More bears. Henry tightened his grip on the lantern. His mind screamed at him to slam the door, to retreat into the warmth of the cabin. But he didn't move. Because in the snow in front of the bears was something he hadn't expected. Pile of logs. Henry stared, his pulse hammering in his ears. The bear, his bear, had returned. And it had brought help. For a long moment, Henry didn't move. He wasn't sure if he could. The bear stood at the edge of the storm, its massive body partially covered in snow, its breath coming in visible clouds. But it wasn't the only one. Behind it, 3 more bears lingered, their hulking silhouettes shifting in the darkness. And in front of them, laid neatly on the snow, was a pile of firewood. Henry's pulse roared in his ears. The wind howled through the trees, but everything else felt still. Unreal. He had lived alone for years, seen the wild in all its brutal beauty, but this was something beyond his understanding. The bear he had helped, weak, starving on the edge of death, had not only survived. It had returned. And it had brought others with it. Henry tightened his grip on the doorframe, his breath curling in the frigid air. His instincts, honed by a lifetime in the wilderness, screamed at him to retreat. A group of bears this close to his cabin was dangerous. 1 bear was a risk. 4? That was unheard of. And yet they didn't move toward him. They didn't growl. They didn't charge. They simply stood there, waiting. Henry's eyes flicked to the firewood, thick, sturdy logs, more than enough to last him through the storm. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. This isn't real, it couldn't be. Bears didn't do this. They didn't bring offerings. They didn't repay debts. And yet, here they were. ###, a silent understanding. The wind picked up, sending a fresh spray of snow swirling between them. The bear, the one he had nursed back to strength, took a step forward. Its paws crunched softly against the ice-crusted ground. Henry tensed. But the bear didn't threaten him. Didn't bare its teeth or lower its head in warning. Instead, it simply stood there, looking at him. The same way it had that first night. A silent understanding passed between them, something deeper than instinct, older than words. Henry hesitated only a second before stepping forward. The bears didn't move. He crouched, his fingers numb as he reached for the firewood. He picked up a log, feeling the solid weight of it in his hands. A fresh wave of cold wind whipped through the trees. When he looked up, the bears were already turning, their massive forms disappearing into the blizzard. Gone. Just like that. Henry stood there for a long time, holding the log in his hands as the snow gathered around him. ##### The fire burns bright. Back inside, the fire roared in the hearth, stronger than it had in days. Henry sat in his chair, watching the flames curl around the fresh logs, the warmth seeping into his bones. He should have been scared. He should have been confused. Instead, he felt something else. Awe. Bears didn't bring gifts. They didn't form connections with people. And yet one had. One had remembered. That night, as the storm raged outside, Henry felt something he hadn't in a long time. He wasn't alone. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending waves of warmth through Henry's small cabin. But no matter how bright the flames burned, he couldn't shake the cold knot of confusion lodged in his chest. Bears didn't bring firewood. Bears didn't return favors. And yet that was exactly what had happened. He sat in his worn-out chair, staring at the flickering light, replaying the moment over and over in his head. The way the bear had looked at him, not with hunger, not with fear, but with understanding. The way the others had waited, silent and still, before vanishing into the storm. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know that nature followed its own rules. Animals fought for survival. They hunted. They killed. They took what they needed. But this was something else. Henry took a slow sip of his coffee, his hands steady despite the thoughts racing through his mind. The logical part of him wanted to dismiss it. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe the bears had simply knocked over a dead tree, and the logs had just happened to roll toward his cabin. Maybe the storm had made him see things that weren't there. But deep down, he knew better. The bear had come back for a reason. And that reason wasn't over. #### Tracks in the snow. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick layer of untouched snow. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the air was crisp, carrying the fresh scent of pine. Henry stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the frozen wood. The wind had carved deep ridges into the snowdrifts, but there, just beyond the edge of his cabin, tracks remained. Massive paw prints, half filled with fresh snow, leading toward the tree-line. The bear had been here again. Henry followed the trail with his eyes, his heartbeat steady but strong. He should leave it alone. Let the bear go. He had already pushed his luck feeding it. He had already broken the rules. But something inside him needed to know. So he grabbed his coat, his rifle, just in case, and started walking. #### The path to something unknown. Tracks led deeper into the woods, winding through the towering pines. Henry moved cautiously, every step precise, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The silence of the forest wrapped around him, broken only by the distant caw of a raven. Then he saw it. Clearing. And in the center of that clearing, lying half-buried beneath the snow, was something that should not have been there. Henry's breath caught in his throat. A pile of old animal bones, picked clean, stacked neatly. Like an offering. His stomach tightened. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. Animals didn't do this. The bear's tracks circled the pile as if it had lingered there, waiting. Waiting for him. Henry exhaled slowly, gripping his rifle tighter. He had spent his life in these mountains. He thought he had seen everything. But as he stood there, staring at the impossible, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't just helped that bear. He had entered into something far older. Far deeper. A debt had been repaid. But what if the bear wasn't done yet? Refinements. Smiling face with smiling eyes. Henry turned the rifle casing over in his fingers, his heart hammering. The brass was smooth and familiar, .308 caliber, common for hunting rifles. Someone had been here. Someone had fired at something big. His mind snapped back to the wounds on the bear's side. The deep claw marks. The way it had collapsed on his porch, weak but still alive. He had assumed it had been in a fight with another animal, another bear maybe. But what if he had been wrong? What if someone had tried to kill it? The thought sent a slow chill through him, colder than the wind biting at his face. Henry straightened, scanning the trees. The forest was quiet, but something about it felt different now, like he wasn't alone. Like someone had been here recently. Watching. #### a hunter's warning. Back at the cabin, Henry wasted no time. He stored the rifle casing in an old tin on his shelf, then stoked the fire, letting its warmth chase away the unease curling in his gut. By midday, the storm had fully cleared, and he decided to head into town. Sargus Hollow wasn't much, but if there was talk of a wounded bear, or worse, someone hunting illegally, he'd hear it there. The bell over the general store's door jingled as Henry stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. Greg, the store owner, looked up from behind the counter. "Well, if it ain't our favorite hermit," Greg said with a grin. "Storm treat you all right?" Henry nodded, scanning the room. A few of the usuals were there, old-timers sipping coffee near the stove, a woman flipping through a seed catalog. But his eyes landed on a man he didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in heavy hunting gear, a knife strapped to his belt. He stood by the counter, talking to one of the clerks. Henry didn't like the look of him. "You hear anything about bears up in the valley?" Henry asked Greg, keeping his voice casual. Greg scratched his beard. "Funny you ask. Gus was in here a couple days back, said he saw something real strange out near Blackridge Pass. Big bear, but it wasn't acting normal." Henry's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" Greg lowered his voice. Said it wasn't aggressive, just watching him. Almost like it was looking for something. Spooked him enough that he backed right out of there. Henry's stomach twisted. The hunter at the counter laughed suddenly, shaking his head. "Y'all are too soft on these beasts," he said, voice carrying across the store. "Bears ain't nothing but problems when they get too used to people. Best way to handle 'em is a clean shot between the eyes." Henry's grip on the counter tightened. The man turned slightly, and for the first time, Henry saw the patch on his jacket. A small emblem, 3 mountain peaks, and the words Wardell Hunting Outfitters. Henry had heard of them before. Not locals. They moved from place to place, taking contracts where they could. Some were legal, some weren't. Some were the kind of men who didn't care what they killed, so long as they got paid. The hunter turned, locking eyes with Henry. His grin was sharp, his expression knowing. "You wouldn't happen to have seen any big bears up your way, would you, old man?" Henry held his stare, his gut churning with unspoken anger. If these men had been hunting that bear, if they were the reason it had come to him, wounded and desperate, then this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.